Thank you for the organizers for this event. I'm very happy to be presenting in front of actual people, and a lot of you are online joining us. This paper is a byproduct of my thesis. So I'm focusing on one specific question in an interview that I asked of exophonic translators. I'll go into detail about that. So in order to talk about even though I'm going to focus on one specific question in the interview, I need to give a little bit of background information because the specific topic I study is quite invisible in translation studies and is kind of niche. So in translation studies in general, the favored directionality, that is the direction of translation, is from a second language or foreign language into one's first language. But there's a lack of terminological consensus when we want to study or know more about L2 translation. So there's some authors who call it service translation, verse translation, inverse translation, and L2 translation, and then some very wordy ones like translation into a non-mother tongue, among many others. So that lack of a terminology to talk about the practice kind of doesn't help us understand and study and find these studies actually in the first place. So, and there's also that points to a lack of a consistent and strong body of studies dealing with this practice. And there is a greater lack of visibility of this practice in the Anglophone context, especially. So if I'm going to be focusing more on Anglophone translation studies, but some of these, as you'll see, a lot of these, the few studies that there are written and published in English, even though the authors themselves are mostly not native English speakers. And there's also a difference between literary and technical translation. That is, the existing studies, the majority of them deal with technical translation and not literary translation. So to start with, L2 translation has been talked about in translation studies, both explicitly and implicitly. In proto-translation theory, like in translators' commentaries and introduction, before the advent of the discipline, there were some translators would use words such as to translate something into our own culture or language. So that implicitly says that the translator is in a position where it's their own domestic or their own first language for culture. So, but there's also more explicit views against the practice in translation studies that do say categorically you shouldn't do this. But this is, for me, it was very interesting to come across this because in my training as a translator back in Brazil, we never had this problem. We translated in both directions. Most of my friends who I met at university who are now full-time translators translate into both directions. That's actually more a common practice in technical translation. And we had the same amount of modules and hours training translation into L1 and L2. So for us, it was never a problem. And in many countries of languages of like limited diffusion, you could find similar examples or similar opinions on that. There are also professional bodies and charters like the Nairobi Conference at the UN that do say that translation means translating from one language into another, passing a text or something from one language into another, but then they specify ideally into the translator's first language. So sometimes they are more explicit, as I said, or sometimes more implicit, but normally they are against translating into an L2. And this is what we could call the L1 norm, or using Chesterman's term, the L1 translation mean. So in the literary market, it's unheard of, and the very few examples of L2 translation are very much invisible. It is used, L2 translation, as a pedagogical tool in the L2 classroom because it's a practice that helps learners learn a second language. As I said before, the majority of studies that can be found deal with technical translation, and most of these studies are conducted in countries where they speak languages of limited diffusion. So mostly in Eastern Europe, actually, and I'll give you some examples now. So in the history of L2 translation studies as it stands, so the first study to deal directly with this practice was Mamaridou's study, and in it she analyzed the transfer of conceptual metaphors in translation. It was the first study to test directionality. It was a very limited study, not very widely read, although in L2 translation studies it is very well known. Then Campbell in '98 came out with a book where he talked about L2 translation and teaching competence and in the multilingual Australian context. Then there were two conference and subsequent conference proceedings dealing precisely with L2 translation. One was in Spain in the early noughties, and then in Slovenia, and then they both resulted in conference proceedings that are entirely dedicated to L2 translation. They're mostly written in English. In the case of Kelly et al., they have some in Spanish, and in Grossman et al., they have some in French as well. Pochhorn in 2005 was the first extensive study of L2 translation published by a major publishing house, Routledge. In it, she presents us with a theoretical review of L2 translation, which based a lot of what I'm talking here about. And she also analyzes existing Slovene to English literary translations. And in it, she concludes that a lot of them work because native speakers could not identify which texts were translated by the L1 and the L2 translator. Then in 2007, Pavlovich came out with the first, at least first that we know of, doctoral study on directionality, specifically on L2 translation, and with a more positive conclusion. But it was non-domain specific, so there were technical and literary. Then in Prague, 2019, I was lucky to be to be presenting there. It was the third, again, as far as we know, third ever conference dedicated entirely to this topic. And just to point out, in the conference, there was just one native English speaker. All the 35 other presenters were from all over the world, most of them speaking in English and presenting in English, but were not living in English-speaking countries. So I mentioned exophonic translation. It's in the title of my paper. What is exophony? Andrea already introduced us a little bit to it. I came across the term when translating Yoko Tawada from German into Brazilian Portuguese. She writes in German and Japanese, but she's Japanese. And Wright, who's also a translator of Yoko Tawada and my supervisor, she defined it as the most simplest of terms, writing in a foreign language, simple as that. But then she talks more about how in focusing on style and how meaning is generated by it, the term exophonic represents an important shift in how we approach writing by non-native speakers and a return to the late, somewhat neglected relationship between form and meaning in literature. By that, she means that we shouldn't be focusing that much on the background of these writers, but more on the text themselves and how they can be creative, how they innovate the language they're using. And then we have two quotes. I'm not going to read them because they're quite long, but two quotes by Tawada herself. This is from a manifesto travelogue that she published in Japanese. Hasn't been translated into any languages so far, or published at least. These are translations that I've done. They're indirect translation from my friend translated them into Portuguese, and then I translated that into English. So basically, she's talking in this essay, book-length essay. She talks about her coming across the term in the German-speaking context and how she views it. So she talks a little bit more about migrant literature, and then she says that not everyone who writes in a foreign language is an immigrant, and not all immigrants express themselves in a Creole. The world today is a more complex place. So the example that Andrea brought of Jhumpa Lahiri is a similar one. She decided to move into Italian. She was not forced into it by a migration situation or something like that. And so that's also the case of Tawada. She came to Germany as in her 20s and just decided to learn German and stay. And then one very important aspect of exophony is the creative stance and the idea of leaving your old language and adopting a new one. So it's a decision. It's nothing that's like forced on you, and it's also a creative pursuit. So as I've said, my idea is to propose that L2 translation, and maybe more specifically L2 literary translation, be called exophonic translation, or rather that we could look at these translations through this lens. So in this, we would focus more on creativity aspects of L2 translation, rather than focusing too much on fluency and trying to prove whether the text is fluent and whether the translators themselves are fluent as well. In it, creative writing and literary translation are heavily, closely linked. And then exophonic, by calling these translations exophonic instead of L1, L2, non-mother tongue, whatever, it wouldn't rely too heavily on definitions of the translators L1, L2, mother tongue, etc. It does not aim to analyze the product based on whether it's natural, if it's fluent, or if a native speaker reader can, decide that it's acceptable. It also includes expression and attitudes towards the text. So also would include paratexts and commentary by the translators as well. So that also comes into play, because we're not necessarily analyzing the text too much, but rather the way these translators approach the text. And in turn, I mean, that was my initial idea. I don't know if that will come to fruition, but it would be to translate all these findings into a literary theory of L2 translation. So the problem with all of this is that it's really hard to find examples of L2 translation that we could analyze. They are scattered around in languages that I don't have access to, for example. So if we wanted to analyze strictly these translations from, say, the Korean into English, or many other languages that actually we have in the interview corpus, it would be, I mean, I cannot do that because I cannot read in Korean, for example. But it's also, we started questioning whether it wouldn't be more sensible to actually ask the translators themselves what they think about the practice, and whether that would be more interesting than actually having to compare side by side a text and decide if the text is fluent or not, or if it fits our expectations. So there are some well-known cases, well-known in meaning for some people who are interested in this specific type of translation, obviously. These are Julia Sanchez, who translates from Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan into English, Anton Huer, who translates from Korean, Bruna Lobato from Portuguese, and Emily Yawon from Korean as well. There are also other examples. There is a big number of Korean translators who are exophonic translators, and they have access to the English publishing market because through Tilted Access Books and Deborah Smith, who won the Man Booker Prize, the International Man Booker Prize for her translation of Han Kang, and she also heads the publishing house. So it does help that an established translator brings all these translators into they're being published by this publishing house. So as I said before, exophonic translation, it is used as a pedagogical tool. So you can find examples, but they are in a different context, usually more academic or as an exercise, really. But there are examples in other countries and continents, mainly, as I said before, in Spain, there are a lot of people doing this type of translation and testing these types of translations as well. And as I said, in my own background in Brazil, that's something that we do very often. A lot of these examples that we find both in these conferences and then in other texts that we find on L2 translations are from Eastern Europe. So that's also a context where these L2 translations are coming from. And then we have, as I said, the example of Korea. We have a lot of Chinese translation studies that are, because China has a different relationship to English and to the West than former colonies like Brazil has. So it would be interesting to tap into these specific contexts as well. So to try to understand who these translators are, once I decided that I was going to also look at the person behind the translation, we released a call for translators in the mailing lists and the Translators Association, asking for literary translators to come and contact us if they wanted to be interviewed, if they want to be part of the research. And then obviously I was interviewing them in English, so they would also have to be able to speak about their practice in English. So that's another layer. So I'm going to focus today on one specific question of the questionnaire that I asked them, which was on fluency and creativity. This is a separate section, more towards the end of the interview. In the interview, I asked questions like, what do you think, what do you consider your mother tongue to be, or first language? I use different terminology. I asked them specifically on directionality, but today, this is an ongoing project, so I don't have many conclusions per se. I'm just going to share with you what I've found so far and the patterns I could see emerging from their answers, and then we can, yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to understand what happened there. So the main problem with this is that I started to question myself. When I came up with the questions, obviously there was a reasoning behind all of them. But then when I started interviewing people, I started to realize how the very fact that I brought up the terms fluency and creativity and didn't define them, it was on purpose. I didn't want to define them. But at the same time, from the answers, you could see that they had very different ideas of fluency and even creativity. So then I realized I had to dive deeper into creativity studies, which is a beast in and of itself, and then fluency versus proficiency, etc. I'll go into more detail now. Obviously, so I interviewed, so just to explain, I forgot to explain that. I interviewed 14 translators. It's not a very big number, and I don't think I can come up with generalizations as well. But as I said, this group of people are very difficult to find. Some of them gave up when they heard I was going to do an interview, because initially it wasn't going to be an interview, because as we all know, we translators are a weird bunch of people, and they just didn't want to, be put into the spot. It's like I'm okay being in the background. I don't want to be put in the spotlight. So they didn't want to be interviewed, some of them, and some of them, obviously, with the pandemic, I had to do most of the interviews during the lockdown. So some of them were also not willing or couldn't really join in on a 1 hour long interview. So just to explain, one of the translators her main occupation is as a creative writer. She is also a literary translator. And obviously her first response to fluency was to see fluency as flow. It's very fitting of a creative writer to see it in that way. So she says that she questions the idea of fluency. The idea itself that if it's fluid, it's superior, which is something that does make sense if we're talking about exophony, because that is also one idea that we need to think about when we're talking about exophonic authors, is that they don't necessarily have to fit in or to do some kind of monolingual passing. So she says, like I mentioned, some of the works that translate don't want to be fluid. So she translates mostly Brazilian literature, but authors who are in Portuguese kind of tricky to read and therefore to translate. And so she says, if it will be an overcorrection if I made them sound, she said, fluent. So she mentions Virginia Woolf in The Stream of Consciousness, and then going in unexpected directions with their fluency. So this is one of the concepts of fluency that came about in the answers. Then we have one of the translators, and then a couple more when they were delving deeper into their answers, mentioned the idea of first being freer in a language when you have more fluency, but then at the same time that, for example, you are more flexible when you have the necessary skill set. You have a base knowledge, and then you can improvise with that. Even one of them does talk about, draws relations with music and improvisation. So you do need to know the basics of what something if you want to improvise on it. But then, for example, translator number 7 said some like talked about fluency in a way that for us reading it, it seems like she means more of some sort of a translation competence. So you can, and to be clear here, you can be fluent in a language, but you don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are competent in translation. And in a way, you could see like translation in and of itself is a language that you can get fluent in, and no matter what you're fluent in the actual languages you're using. So for me, her response has much more to do with translation competence than with fluency in a foreign language. Then actually the first translator I interviewed came right out and said that actually fluency is the enemy of creativity. So the more fluent you strive to be, the more contrived, and like it's kind of a straitjacket. But in a way, I feel that when he said that, he meant more of a fluency as proficiency, in the sense that I started questioning myself and the fact that I used the word fluency. But in this sense, fluency as proficiency, meaning that you learn a foreign language up to the point where something, Cambridge or somewhere else, gives you an official status of you are proficient in that language. Not necessarily. Fluency is a bit more of a slippery term. So this is a very good response, and it kind of guided the responses that happened after that. I kind of used that as a poll. Whatever people respond, I was like, oh, so they're more towards translator number 1 than others, just because they were so sure of what they're saying, and they brought race, for example, when they brought the concept of native speaker as well into their response. So they equate fluency to conformism. So the more conformity, the more fluent you are, the more fluent you strive to be, the more you are conforming to rules and not necessarily being free to create and innovate.
Lúcia, I just want to remember you're running out of time, so
perhaps
come slowly to conclusions.
I'm finishing up. And then just to mention, there was another theme that came up was fluency as control and mastery, which goes against the free thing. And some exophonic authors actually, like Tawada, don't like the idea of having to master a language and control a language. And this is just an example of one of the responses that they said that they're more creative in their second language than in Swedish, because they're more aware of their English vocabulary because they learned it as a foreign language rather than in Swedish, it comes naturally to them. So they're more aware when they're doing something in a foreign language, and then they feel more creative because of that, which again goes against so they're very differing answers, but you can see some patterns emerging from their answers so far. This I'm already talked about it in a way, so another example. And as I said, the idea of fluency as proficiency and the difference between the two terms. And these are my references. Yeah, I think so. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Sorry for being so strict, but
no worries. It's part of it.
I think there are also some questions that I didn't want to shorten the discussion. So I start reading the questions you've got.
Mm-hmm.
The first is from Ruth. Most advocacy for L2 translation I hear and read about concerns translation into English. How is L2 translation into, say, Brazilian Portuguese perceived?
Well, there aren't many. The thing is, in Brazil, we are especially in literature, we translate a lot. Translation makes up for a big chunk of the publishing market, has always been the case. So we have enough people in the country to translate into Portuguese. So it doesn't happen that also, not that often. It's actually something that I struggle to find examples of non-native speakers of Brazilian Portuguese translating into Brazilian Portuguese or writing in Brazilian Portuguese. There's very few examples that are not very substantial. So I don't think we would have, I cannot speak for all Brazilian translation study scholars, but I don't think we would have necessarily a problem with that. But again, I don't think that many people learn our language to start with. We have kind of a underdog syndrome going on. So maybe I'm wrong, but the thing is, the fact that English is so accessible by so many people from all these contexts helps that in the end we mostly talk about auto translation into English, because it means that you can read it and you can spread the word about it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how it's perceived, to be honest. We don't have many cases to be able to know that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question from Eva. She asks, would you say that the trend towards being less judgmental when exophonic translations are concerned coincides with the trend towards foreignizing translations in general?
Well, it does. It's interesting because in the cases that I have of auto translations, a lot of them are of texts that are a bit transgressive and are difficult to translate to start with. So one of them concerns a text, this author who's Chinese and who's now starting to write in English, and her translator had to come to terms with the fact that his author not only reads in English very well, but also is able to criticize his translation and look closely into it, and is now writing herself in English and might in the future translate herself into English. So it does, I mean, you can find some in a lot of the existing auto translations a trend that a lot of these texts are more it works when you're foreignizing, really. But I don't think so. Some of them do kind of, as I said before, kind of a monolingual drag, and they openly admit to that, so that they don't want to be perceived as exophonic translators or L2 translators. So they kind of try to fit into it as much as possible, so that they're not necessarily foreignizing, even though their attitudes towards translation are pretty much would be more towards the foreignizing end of the spectrum. They are some of them they have, it's very different from the corpus. So I don't think I can, conclude that. I mean, it does help that people are more open to the fact that translations are translations, and that you don't have to adapt too much or be too fluent or be too natural. But at the same time, I don't think that in the body of works that I like, in these interviewees texts that they translated, I don't think foreignizing plays that much of a part, even though there are some of these texts have a theme that would help when you foreignize. But yeah, I don't know if I replied very well to the question.
I think it was a good reply, especially as we are at the end of your time slot. So thanks you
Sorry for that.
very much again, also for being in time.